Okay, I want to connect the parable books to a literary tradition that might be surprising to you. Um, so, Uncle Tom's Cabin stands as a prototypical novel in the US sentimental tradition that has inspired, allegedly, so many people to the cause of the Civil War. At the end of the novel, she says that every individual need only see to it that they feel right and thus be a constant benefactor to the human race. And this idea that feeling sad over the suffering of others has the potential to cause political change is a long-standing idea. But many people have also contested it. They see looking at suffering as something that can be voyeuristic. There can be a plateau for how much sympathy people are cognitively or culturally willing to deploy, which we hear with discussions of things like compassion fatigue. So Butler's interesting on this question. She has explicitly argued that she does not see feeling the other's pain as the solution to creating a socially just world. Using the example of contact sports, she argues that the threat of shared pain does not necessarily make people behave better towards each other. In Butler's imaginary future, feeling can make people more attentive to the impact of pain and harm, but is no cure for all of society's ills. In the parable books, other people have hyperempathy syndrome. But it's only Lauren Olamina who seems to have this calling to save the world through radical change. So many of the other people who are afflicted by hyperempathy actively avoid others so that they can avoid pain. So key to Butler's discussion of hyperempathy is the fact that it is solely an imagined response, a delusional disorder. And Butler marks the delusion as having the same impact as the real. Delusional pain hurts just as much as pain from actual trauma, Butler argues. So what if it's all in your head? So she gives credence to the idea of imagined feeling producing real effects, which is important in considering the work that sympathy or empathy can inspire when people often see it as fake or insincere, or just inadequate, right? So I've often thought about her disbelief in shared pain as a model for political change over the years. And right now, I ask myself that question almost daily. What kind of suffering stories might make people who do not feel like they should wear masks or not feel like they do in many Asian countries that wearing a mask is a consideration for others? I mean, these are cultural differences, right? So a few years ago, a video editor wrote an essay for Huffington Post titled, "I don't know how to explain to you that you should care about other people." It's been circulating as a meme, sort of only attributed to Anthony Fauci recently. But I think that question is something that Butler has explored often throughout her career because she can be pretty misanthropic about human beings as a species and what human beings can do to each other. And she often discussed struggling with her pessimism. And that's most explicitly articulated in Dawn, which is the first of the Xenogenesis trilogy, in which humans encounter the Oankali, this alien race, after nuclear war has decimated the planet. The Oankali rebuild the planet for humans, but the planet and humans have to evolve in return for their help. They have to change species. And as with a lot of other Butler texts, there's a lot of coercion. Not all these relationships are consensual. But one of the things that the Oankali believes, as well as the protagonist Lilith comes to believe, is that human beings have to adapt and change to survive. So Butler's very interested in evolutionary biology and thinking about power and how people will organize themselves in relationship to difference and power. And this has resulted in some critics accusing her of biological essentialism in scholarship, particularly in works like Dawn. But her books have a consistent set of principles that the protagonist, who is almost always this tall, strong, so disciplined she can be off-putting to some African American woman, who observes and voices these power dynamics. The strong will dominate the weak will seek those who they think are strong to protect them. People will hurt and sacrifice others when they're vulnerable. Human beings are afraid of difference which often takes the form of race and gender performance. Butler's protagonists are often seen as unnatural women in some way. You can see how Lauren Olamina is accused of that here in relationship to motherhood, right? In Butler's text, human beings often consider difference a threat to their own survival. So her protagonists build these coalitions and community to respond to these fundamental beliefs about who people are and how they'll treat each other. So this understanding of human nature structures Lauren's activism much more than feeling. Uh, she says there's nothing supernatural about this. It's delusional disorder, but it hurts like hell. And we know obviously that other people with hyperempathy don't have her skills. They're often more likely to be victimized because they have a harder time rebounding in relationship to things they encounter in their world. And sadistic people like to torture them. So her hyperempathy can actually incapacitate her when she flees or fights human predators. And so initially the key question as it relates to the relationship between feeling and politics in the parable novels may seem to be whether Olamina's hyperempathy syndrome is integral to her political prophecy or an obstacle to it. So in the parable books, feeling right is quite difficult after the apocalypse. There's often no time to mourn. Showing emotion or suffering makes people a target for others. And so given these conditions, her post-apocalyptic novels basically are asking, how should one feel after the apocalypse? How can one feel? If feeling actually motivates actions, Butler seems to think that feelings such as fear and suspicion, hatred, need, and greed particularly motivate. And so Butler's question is like, how do you motivate people to feel right and motivate political vision after the failure of revolutions? And so the parable text, somewhat surprisingly, I think, teach the necessity of relegating feeling to the outskirts of personal choices in these kind of apocalyptic circumstances, even as Butler treats hyperempathy as integral to Lauren Olamina's development as a person. So on trial throughout the text is not only feeling in itself, but right feeling and what it's made of. So Olamina's anti-individualism, her persistence in seeing her family as a part of her commitment to the entire human race, and thus her work for the human race as work for her family, and the ways in which she removes a language of feeling from her political directives, makes feeling a prerequisite for her politics, even as she does not see empathy as the key to curing all of society's problems, which I think is pretty provocative as a claim. So this is this quote she had about how she thought about things like sports and boxing and football. And clearly, if you could actually feel pain that you inflicted or see others' pain, you'd be different. And she's like, nope, not so much. All right, so let me shift to religion and liberation. I want to talk about the role of religion in this text. Earthseed, the Books of the Living, reads as a New Age text. It contains all of the attendant commonsensical wisdom and is marketed by Olamina as the one true path to salvation. And Octavia Butler actually took the New Age theology she creates in this text seriously enough to try unsuccessfully to convince her publishers that a New Age audience would be interested in the parable books, as would a science fiction audience. So she wanted them to put some books in the New Age section, which is interesting. Parable of the Sower, which came out in 1993, and the sequel came out in 1998, were released during this really multi-million sales increase in the 1990s of books roughly grouped under categories such as New Age, mind, body, spirit, spirituality, occult, self-help, Western variations of Eastern traditions. There's this rapid growth. And the amorphousness of this category on the shelves speaks to the various traditions that are used by New Age authors. Buddhism, Christianity, psychology, spiritual traditions of indigenous cultures, from Celtic to Native American. Some of the most successful New Age texts include books not only on or work that includes like tarot and astrology, meditation, prayer, and also, again, the sort of common sense instruction for living. It's often sold as common sense. So despite the diversity of traditions informing the genre, many New Age authors consistently focus on self-knowledge or self-transformation as the personal cure-all for all of society's problems. And they proceed from the proposition that changing the self is the only aspect of living that is within your control. And the New Age text typically instructs one how to change one's feelings about oneself. This emphasis on feeling makes the New Age text part of a sentimental tradition. right? So that all you must do is change how you feel about yourself, and you'll change the world. You'll see both yourself and the world differently. A change in vision is a real change. So you can see how it's under attack, or it's been criticized even more so as something that's really can lend itself to egocentrism. And New Age text, I think importantly, did respond to a post-cultural revolutionary era. After the civil rights efforts, the sexual revolution, greater awareness of class inequities, and a questioning of all forms of authority, the promised better society hadn't materialized. And so what do people do with that? And many people found something in turning inward. So the New Age text demands cliche too. And I think the cliche signifies that which the reader already knows, but is hidden from herself because of superfluous things in the world that don't really matter. It teaches the reader to find the supposed real self, live in the moment. And by changing vision, recognizing the impermanence of life, you're transformed and again transform others. So I'm really curious about whether or not some of you felt like Earthseed seemed like a cliche to you. The language used, the essentials of the text and religion are that human beings can escape change. Change is inevitable. They must learn to shape God with forethought, care, and work to educate and benefit their community, their families, themselves, and contribute to destiny, right? So probably some a little hokey to you. Many New Age authors speak to this impermanence. Religious scholar Catherine L. Albanese has argued that the classical metaphysical tradition and the contemporary New Age tradition depend upon a notion of flow, that the meaning of New Age spirituality must be grasped in metaphors, descriptions, and cultural practices that literally go with the flow. So the notions of flow and impermanence play a role in Earthseed, as does an end times aura that informs some New Age works. Christian fundamentalists who participate in the religious rite often argue for the recreation of a mythical moment in the past. But Olamina writes that such nostalgia is impractical in Earthseed, right? Past is past. What was cannot come again. To survive, know the past. Let it touch you. Then let the past go. And again, it's a cliche, but seems right? But it is very much, I think, speaking against some models of Christianity, which I think is really important in thinking about this text. Some people really want to read it in relationship to African American theological tradition, which honestly I just think is wrong. So Christian fundamentalists both romanticize history and see the apocalypse as part of a path preordained by God, while Butler, writing as a New Ager, sees the apocalypse as an aspect of self-making. So the emphasis on the self manifested in the merger between God and person, and emphasis on I and you, is one of the most politically problematic aspects of New Age text. In Notes to Myself, which was a really well-known New Age text by Hugh Prather, he commented that one of the pitfalls of self-actualization is that the preoccupation with actualization can easily lead to egocentricity. So in contrast to the 19th century tradition of sentimentality and sentimental works that I was discussing, that focus on inducing sympathy for the suffering and pain of others, the New Age text tries to elicit self-sufficiency when confronted with suffering and asks the reader to recast the suffering in self and the world and to envision it as something else, to really turn inward. And the penchant for cliche and the focus on suffering that turns inward, which is very common in New Age literature, contributes, I think, to this absence of aesthetic sophistication. And I do think then that there's a reason that Earthseed, the Books of the Living, is this populist kind of popular text written for ordinary people. It's sharing many of these qualities. It's intentionally not avant-garde. It's not complex. It's not encouraging a multiplicity of interpretations, even though it's open enough that it kind of does. So despite these many characteristics that it has in common with contemporary New Age works, I think it makes a radical departure from New Age texts as it distances itself from the I, right? It distances itself from the individuals. So to inspire action, Olamina self-consciously chooses to embrace generic commodification of her theology. So this is like, how do you sell this, right? There are few New Age texts like Earthseed in our New Age universe, right, is those texts, again, are mostly about individual therapy, not about community transformation. And Olamina moves beyond this logic, however, as she focuses on how the world works. She pushes against the individual focus. And so she's slightly tweaking it. So Earthseed is about community. So Butler's language emphasis we and not I. The suffering body, while it inspires the text, is nonetheless outside of Earthseed's language, as it is it's central to other New Age texts. Like, it's just like, what's going on in my body? How can I see things differently? So a member of Earthseed is only authentic if he acts on his beliefs, right? Beliefs will not save you. So a change in vision is not going to save you. Only actions, Olamina argues, guided and shaped by belief and knowledge, will save you. Belief initiates and guides action, or it does nothing. And so by arguing that only actions save you, Olamina displaces self-reflection and self-transformation as the foundation of the New Age text, right? Purpose is the unifying principle, not breaking away from the spiritual seeker's suffering. So Butler also speaks to this intellectual discomfort with consumption, right, by explicitly arguing that the only strategic commodification will result in successful dissemination of radical ideas. So Olamina is struggling with the means by which she can circulate Earthseed. And then, her friend, as you recall, will say she has to use these same marketing tools that she slightly disparages in order to compel people to her project. Lynn tells her, look, focus on what people want and tell them how your system will help them get it. And Olamina's like, well, I don't know. And Lynn tells Olamina to preach the way her Christian American enemy Jarrett does. He begins with this proposition that he's on God's side, and this positions everyone who opposes him against God. Lynn suggests that Olamina should preach with a similar certainty that would amount to her strongly asserting that her faith was the only path, right? And Lauren's uncomfortable with this. And she chose religion as a format, right, to disseminate Earthseed, because she thought it would take something as essentially human and essentially irrational as religion to keep people focused and keep it going for generations, if it takes generations. So Butler allows Lauren to recognize the value of religious framework. And so there's a way in which Olamina is both a true believer and not. She's a believer in action to get somewhere, but so much of Earthseed is actually a marketing strategy, right? So Olamina had rejected preaching and telling folksy stories and emphasizing a profit motive, prosperity gospels, basically, and self-consciously using her very charismatic persona to sell Earthseed and dismiss other ideologies. She says she doesn't want to become a demagogue, but Butler actually thinks she is, a power seeker. She does say that, and sometimes she doesn't always she's wrote that she didn't always like Olamina. But nonetheless, Olamina comes around to that. She's compelled by Lynn's arguments that her resistance to using the tools of commodification leaves the field to people who are demagogues, to the Jarretts of the world. And there have always been Jarretts. Probably there always will be. And so from then on, with the pragmatism of it's pretty consistent with all of Butler's heroines, Olamina uses the tools of the New Age to create change, right? She recognizes that people are searching for solutions to witnessing, experiencing suffering, and that cliche and populist responses are some of the most compelling answers. And so amidst the cliche and populist discourses and really simple messages, with his emphasis on suffering and individual therapeutic transformation as the key to eradicating the pain caused by oppression, Butler is really sort of laying out a format for how you sort of sell change in order to make it. So I think Butler ultimately presents the moral that the project of producing populist text for mass consumption cannot be left to those with really unproductive and dangerous dreams. And it can't be abandoned by those who truly desire revolution. So I'll leave you to sit with that as we think about how that might be, or the message there might be relevant for our present. So Dreams of the Future is really where this text ends. And I want to end a bit by talking about generational conflict, which is also big right now, lots of boomer stuff. I don't know if the rest of you were as wrecked as I was when I first read it, and every time I read it, by Larkin Asha's treatment of her mother. Um, Generational conflicts between mothers and daughters is obviously a big fiction theme. However, there's a particular valence to it in Black fiction, which is involved the ways in which slavery and racism and structural inequality place this extra burden on the bond and the kinds of conflicts that spring from Black daughters, criticism of their mother's way of negotiating this burden. So we see it in Instance, the Life of a Slave Girl, in which Harry Jacobs famously wrote about how horrible it is to bring girls into slavery because they would be forced to perpetual bondage and to perpetuate that bondage. In Toni Morrison's Beloved, inspired by the real story of Margaret Garner, Sethe is haunted by the ghost of her daughter because she killed her child rather than let her be taken into slavery. More recently, in N.K. Jemison's high fantasy Broken Earth trilogy, the protagonist is discriminated against for her gifts, and her daughter, also gift, is taken from her and raised to understand her mother as bad, somewhat monstrous. It's a fantasy novel and thus not marked by traditional racial categories of the US or historical frameworks, but I do think there are Black mother-daughter tropes there. Lauren and Larkin's relationship should be read in this history of fiction and in understanding the ways in which discrimination impacts normal generational tensions. And there's a gendered component here, just like I think there are narratives about fathers and sons, and then the racial inflections of that. But the Lauren's choice to be a leader is also an act to her daughter of improper motherhood. Whereas Lauren saw her activism as making a world for her daughter. Like there's some version that she should have just sacrificed absolutely everything, including Earthseed, to find her daughter. She should have just converted to Christianity so she could have had her daughter, right? So Larkin, as Asha, offers another meditation, I think, on escape and liberty. I think both books on some level are about how we can become free. Parable of the Sower begins with them gated in, trying to escape the conflict, and Lauren always knew that they would have to be prepared to flee. There's a philosopher named Neil Roberts who's written about marronage, a term taken from Maroons who escaped from slavery and live in hidden communities. And he thinks about the act of being in flight as being an ongoing part of the Black experience, always moving towards freedom. So we can imagine some people saw being gated in as their way to escape the world. We could say that Lauren's escape from the destruction of their community might be an example of an ongoing liberatory practice of Black folks. Lauren builds an alternative community, a new world, which is really where she ends as well. She wants people to imagine an alternative world and to build it. That's another form of escaping. For many, Christianity is escape. It is from Marcus. And then Larkin or Asha uses virtual reality. It's an alternative world that gives her some freedom within the world she inhabits and also provides her a way of living, even if some people would not see that as productive or real because it's virtual. But both she and her mother make new worlds. They have that in common. It's a point of connection that could bring them together, but unfortunately it doesn't. So both of them might model unrealistic escape to people. But for both of them, it's a creative and political act, and not escape as much as it is getting people to imagine something truly other and to inhabit new ways of being. Which brings me to my favorite line from Parable of the Talents. It's at the end when Lauren writes, "If you want a thing, truly want it so badly that you need it as you need air to breathe, then unless you die, you will have it. Why not? It has you. There is no escape. What a cruel and terrible thing escape would be if escape were possible." So I don't know if that's true. And I'd be curious to hear in our discussion if you think it is or not. Lauren, of course, may not always be a reliable narrator. There are obviously things that we want that we don't have, but it seems to be a meditation on desire as a thing that is always with us. and that if we lose it, we lose ourselves. So the heading off into space shuttles, if we see these books as If This Goes On novels, is less about imagining that we find our home in space and more about believing deeply in the possibility of a felt desire to build new worlds being something that makes us who we are, right?